CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome to our second edition of CFL 110, from end zone to end zone, taking you around the Canadian Football League every week here on the Winnipeg Sports Talk channel and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. If you're checking us out on YouTube, make sure to search CFL 110 and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your favorite audio pods. Going to be a fun one today. We've got a lot to get to coming out of week 2, heading into week 3. And let's welcome in the man himself, Jeff Hamilton from the Winnipeg Free Press. Hammer, it is great to have you back on the show. Great response from episode number 1, and time to get her going for the second time this season.
Yeah, can you imagine? They wanted us back for another week, or at least we just decided to come back. One of the two is true. I'll let the viewers figure that one out. But sun's shining, feeling great, man. Ready to. I'm looking forward to an exciting slate of games in week 3, but I'm just as equally excited to look back on week 2 and go over some of the top stories in the 3-down loop.
Well, listen, just before we get to it, CFL 110 is brought to you by our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg. Is your garage a mess? I know many people deal with that. Do you have a tough time opening your car door because of all the clutter? Maybe you can't even park in your garage because of all that stuff in there. Well, Garage Living and Garage Living Winnipeg can help. In just a few days, you can have a beautiful, clean, functional garage that looks amazing and adds value to your home. Garage Living specializes in stunning polyaspartic floor coatings, high-end, made-in-Canada metal cabinets, slat wall, and overhead storage solutions. Our pal Pat Kanuga, longtime member of the CBC Morning Show, is moved on and is now working with Garage Living, completely transforming people's garages into places where they can work and play, and as we mentioned, adding value to your home. Give Pat a call, 204-999-1234, for a free in-garage consultation. Pat's been a vintage car guy for decades. He knows garages, and whether it is a 10-car garage mahal or a single-car garage in the back of the lane, Pat can come up with a design to meet your needs and revolutionize your garage and your property. Give Pat a call, 204-999-1234. And you can check them out online as well at garageliving.com. Garage Living Winnipeg, garages made for living. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers 0-2 right now, Jeff, and we'll get to the Bombers in a minute. But coming out of last week, I will say this is the top story for many reasons. First of all, the Riders are back. They're 2-0. They're 2-0. They did cost me a perfect 4-0 week against the spread, but it's the way that they've done it. Cardiac comeback kids. Listen, a perfect example of the excitement of the Canadian Football League in the Sunday night game last week, with the Riders coming back down 10 late in the fourth quarter to beat the Hamilton Tiger Cats and get to 2-0 on top of the West.
Yeah, I know there's going to be certain factions of this country, Huss, including right here in Winnipeg, that aren't going to be enjoying looking up at the Saskatchewan Roughriders, sitting currently in first place in the West Division with a 2-0 start. But to your point, man, I mean, that is what CFL football is so great for, is late finishes. And when you look at the Saskatchewan Roughriders team, a club that lost its last 7 games of last year's regular season, to come in this season and play an exciting brand of football and to end up on the right side of the winning ledger is obviously a great thing for Riderville. It's a great thing for the CFL. You need the big markets to be doing well. You need those fan bases to be feeling good. And certainly the Saskatchewan Roughriders have lived up to this new Corey Mace era. I mean, Trevor Harris is looking really good behind center. I've been tough on the Riders and Hamilton as well for going with older quarterbacks who are coming off injury-riddled seasons. But so far, so good for Trevor Harris. I mean, he's taken a handful of big hits and gotten back up. And, you just look at that club and they got a lot of things going for them. There are a couple different things. I mean, we touched on this last week, Huss. AJ Ouellette still hasn't really had his coming out party with the Riders. He's averaging 2.5 yards per run. You could probably handpick somebody from the comment section right now and they would have an average pretty close to that. And then there's the discipline issues. The Riders lead the league in penalties. I think they've been hit with 18 flags for just under 200 penalty yards. So that's kind of some of the issues that need to be cleaned up. But you think about, tidying up that discipline and getting that run game going. Considering those things aren't there just yet, a 2-0 start looks even better for the guys in green.
Well, yeah, and listen, I mean, I think there's two individuals that have really stood out. It hasn't been Ouellette, to your point. First of all, Trevor Harris. And I mean, listen, it's cliche, it's simple, but you can't win without quality quarterbacking in the Canadian Football League. And, with the injury early on at the beginning of the season, it really did sort of deep six their year. And, listen, it's incumbent on the GM to have guys behind your number one that can play and can keep your heads above water. The Riders didn't have that. They've got QB1 back, though, and he has looked phenomenal, especially in clutch times this year. But the other guy that stands out to me is Corey Mace, their new head coach. I mean, he's come in and instilled an attitude, it seems, of a football team that, completely has put the last two seasons in the rearview mirror. It feels like a new era in Saskatchewan and in Regina. And this team, led by their head coach, I think has the confidence that they are able to win on any given night in the Canadian Football League. And they've showed it so far. And I think they've rewarded the messaging from Corey Mace with their fourth quarter performances, turning losses into wins and now sitting on top of the division so far.
Yeah, you got to give a ton of credit to Corey Mace, and his hiring in Saskatchewan, came with a lot of hype. This is a guy who was very highly regarded, obviously, for his time in Toronto as a defensive coordinator, and before that in Calgary, obviously a mainstay with that organization. He got his opportunity, and there was a lot of pressure on him. There's a lot of pressure to turn a team around in one season. I mean. I'll remind viewers here in Winnipeg and elsewhere that the Bombers, when they hired Mike O'Shea, it wasn't hit the ground running like we see in Saskatchewan. It was tough sledding for the first two seasons, losing twice as many games as games they won, and having a 12-24 record through those 2 years. And the reality is it's not easy to just have all those moving pieces come into one play, and your coaching staff and, the guys around you in the coaching staff. They dumped a lot of players from last year to fix some of those culture issues, brought in new players. And, there's a lot that can happen, a lot that needs to happen, to adjust to those changes. And we've seen it. And the fact that they've been able to, muster those comebacks, I'm with you 110%, Huss. I think that is a testament to Corey Mace. If you look at particularly the last game against Hamilton, that's a game where, they're trailing 20-7 going into the second half. Corey Mace isn't happy. You don't see the execution from any phase of his. You see Bo Levi Mitchell cooking, looking like the vintage Bo Levi Mitchell in that first half. And then for them to come out in that second half to get things going right away, you saw the turn. And I think that certainly is the Corey Mace effect. Having these guys believe, having them know that, to have some pride to play in such a passionate city fan base. And I think they've really grabbed a hold of that. And those are signs of good teams when you can win those close games. I mean, we're seeing that with the Bombers this year, where they haven't been able to win, that close game this past week in Ottawa. So, those guys are certainly, there's a lot of key players in there. Shout out to Jamarcus Hardrick, used to be in Winnipeg too. There's a lot of key players that have made an impact for Saskatchewan, but none have been greater than their head coach and Corey Mace and what he's brought to the table this year.
Well, and the Riders are going back-to-back against the Ticats this week, moving it to Mosaic Stadium. We'll get to the Ticats situation in a minute. But just looking back at week 2 in the Canadian Football League, one thing really stood out, and it wasn't necessarily on the field. It was in the stands. And it was more than 54,000 people turning out for 50 Cent for the BC Lions home opener. Overall, I mean, a phenomenal day for the team, the organization, and the league, with a massive crowd, an international superstar, a big win for the home team. And yet, as it always is, Jeff, there's still people that want to take shots and do a yeah, but.
I know. If I could just do a giant eye roll right now, I would, Huss. It's just, this is, I feel like it's not a waste of time because it was a big story this past week, but it's just to give this more air and oxygen is what it is. And I mean, I know it was my recommendation to talk about it, but it's for some reason, there's just a certain sector of fans out there, and they are CFL fans for the most part, that just are dogging on a BC Lions organization that invested the money to bring in rapper 50 Cent. I mean, that was nostalgia at its best, man. I mean, this is a guy that I know you and I listen to a lot growing up too, and it captures a large audience of CFL fans. And you just saw the hype of it. They had 50-something thousand fans, but after the show ended and the dust cleared, if you will, not everybody stuck around. Not everybody sat in their seats and watched the game. And you had projections of there might be 15,000 or 20,000 fans remaining. And I think I saw a lot more from the pictures than that. But even if there was a max exodus to a certain point that came in, it was the fact that they sold those tickets. Those tickets still count in the revenue. And I know that the critics will say, well, it costs money to bring in 50 Cent. Well, you know what? Why complain about creative ways to bring people in the door? There's marketing strategies that are aimed at just that. You bring in, you attract a certain fan base or group of people that wouldn't necessarily be interested in your product with something that they would be interested in. Bring them through the doors, let them check out the atmosphere, let them buy concessions, make money in other elements. And Amar Doman, the new owner, I say new, but it's been a couple of years now. He's just taken this team by storm and just is brought in new idea after new idea. And while there are critics out there that want to stomp on this or whatever, I'm the opposite. I'm going to give him absolute credit for thinking outside the box, for creating an atmosphere at BC Place that hasn't been seen in years. And while yes, there were always going to be people who were going to leave for the exits after the concert, there were plenty of people that stuck around and enjoyed what was a terrific game actually, and a narrow Lions win.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's a little bit 2024, and in the social media world that we live in, that no matter what happens, there's always somebody hating on something. This was, as I said at the start, just phenomenal for the team, the organization, the Canadian Football League, for everybody involved. And to your point about Amar Doman, the work that he has put in and the success that he's had in raising, let's remember where this team was in the Vancouver sports
on
marketplace.
Borderline brink of collapse with their ownership in absolute, disrepair, really.
And to start it off last year with, I guess it was One Republic, which was very well received, and to take it to the next level, both with the artist and the crowd this year, it was exactly the way you want to see one of the biggest and most important markets in the league kick off the season. Now, people are going to leave. Guess what? I've been to Super Bowls where you've wondered where the heck people were in the second half behind, after a special halftime performance. That's just the way things work. And if there's a few extra people that left, so be it. I've also heard from a number of people in the Vancouver market that I think had heard some of this noise that said, hey, hold on a second. I went to the game with 7 people, 3 of which had never been to a BC Lions game before, that were there because 50 Cent was playing, and they had a great time and they're looking forward to going back. I mean, it doesn't completely turn around in a day or just with one person coming in and doing a show beforehand. But I'll tell you what, that work goes a long way to exposing your product, to developing new fans. And listen, it's more than just, and I'll say this about the entire Canadian Football League, I think that, the teams are doing a much better job of adding to the game day experience. What they do outside the stadium before the games in BC, very popular with families, which, it's huge to the next generation of CFL fans. We see it here in Winnipeg, with the Princess Auto tailgate zone outside, the way that's grown. Teams are realizing that, there is more to the CFL experience than what happens between the kickoff and the final buzzer. And in a market like BC with so much competition for eyeballs and attention and that dollar, Amar Doman has stepped up, put out the money to regain relevance for his football team, and the team's backed it up with being pretty darn good these last few seasons, and had a big win to kick off the season at home. So, I don't put a lot of stock into it at all, Jeff. And if anything, I think that the rest of the league looks to BC and looks at the success that they've had, and I wouldn't be surprised if, whether it be for opening dates, for big events, whether it be Labor Day or whatnot, you'll maybe see some more aggressive moves by ownership around the league to
CFL
maybe try and emulate,
series?
emulate the success
series?
that BC's had.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. I mean, and the funny thing is, Huss, is that this comes on the, this is their first kind of showing this year, of what they want to bring to the community in a year that they're going to be doing a lot of cool things leading up to the Grey Cup, right? And that is Amar Doman's, his way of doing things. He wants to be seen, and you want those in that markets. And the irony in all this is that we've seen some growth from Montreal, Toronto, and BC in recent years, and we've seen some, markets that we're more familiar with being popular in Calgary and Edmonton take a bit of a step back. So I like to see the trends that's continuing in those big, much needed markets, and Vancouver and BC as a province is certainly one of them.
Well, and of course, the BC Lions are coming to the Peg on Friday night for a rematch of last year's West Final. The 1-1 Lions versus the 0-2 Bombers. And listen, the 0-2 Bombers is the story around the Canadian Football League right now. If you pop in on any message boards or just paying attention to CFL Twitter, there's a lot of folks, not just in Saskatchewan, but around the league, that kind of like the way this season has started. Certainly not so much in the province of Manitoba and inside the Bomber offices of the organization down at Princess Auto Stadium. How would you gauge the, certainly we know what the Bombers' start is. They're 0-2. It speaks for itself. But the level of panic, concern, if you will, I'm sure it's very different from the fans than inside the building, but let's face it, this is not the way Mike O'Shea and Kyle Walters had this season written up when they were looking ahead to 18 games in their first two of the season.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, I think Bomber fans have been spoiled for so long, right? I mean, ever since that 2019, that glorious run to their Grey Cup drought championship, snapping that Grey Cup drought, they've just had a high expectation. And 2021 did the Bombers no favor, because they went out, they repeated, but not only did they repeat, but their average margin of victory was close to 2 touchdowns. So this became an expectation that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers are going to win week in and week out. And I mean, that's certainly the expectation that they have too. So, let's make that clear. At the same time, we've talked about this team. We've talked about the aging core. We talked about, some of the injuries leading into training camp that left a lot of key players out of those valuable reps, despite what Mike O'Shea has said. The players don't need reps. Yeah, they don't need those reps in training camp to get back in shape like it used to be, decades ago, but they do need to knock off that rust and get game ready. And, whether that's the issue, whether it's the injuries piling up right now, the Bombers are in uncharted territory, man. I mean, Huss, I was at practice on Tuesday, and you're asking questions. My story, I focused on the Winnipeg Free Press today and online, is how the O-line has taken a step back. I mean, these are kind of questions, man, that I haven't asked this O-line or this team in years. And I mean,
it's been the foundation of the success. Like from the day Kyle Walters took over, he identified 2 things that were killing the Bombers. Mm-hmm. A complete lack of quality Canadian talent compared to their contemporaries. And in the previous Joe Mack administration, did not pay any attention to Canadians, but also the offensive line that was getting quarterbacks killed. They addressed the offensive line. They addressed the Canadian quotient. And that has been, in a lot of ways, the line of scrimmage and the homegrown talent, the foundation of this Bomber success. And you're exactly right. It's hard not to watch these last couple of games, particularly, and we can talk about Lofton on the right side with moving on to Jamarcus Hardrick. It's been the interior of the offensive line that, has really struggled at times, and that's made it very problematic for Zach Caleros, and I think attributed to a very subpar start for Zach compared to the high bar that he's set in the past.
Absolutely. Like you said, I mean, the O-line was the identity of the offense. You could argue it was the personality of the team, playing nasty, physical, and the moving parts that, whether it's Jamarcus Hardrick moving on and Eric Lofton coming in, whether it's Patrick Neufeld, missing a large chunk of training camp and having to come back the first week and try to build that chemistry with Eric Lofton to his to his right. And so, there are a lot of missing pieces. I mean, Brady Oliveira being injured doesn't help. I mean, the injuries are piling up with the Bombers, and that gets to my, biggest concern is the depth on this team. I don't think the depth is even close to what it has been in previous years. Whether that was, the scouting staff not doing a good enough job this offseason to bring in the talent needed, whether it's, the racking up of injuries. We certainly see that on the defensive line. I mean, the Bombers are down to 4 D linemen. After Miles Fox and Slesson Haba got injured, and Taekwon Garbett already being on the 6-game injured list, and of course Cameron Lawson being in that group as well. I mean, they're taking hits. Dietrich Nichols still isn't back. Brady Oliveira hasn't practiced this week. So this team is facing, like I mentioned, some uncharted territory. You can make the argument, since that run in 2019, this is the most adversity that this team has faced. And so, this even the questions to Mike O'Shea, asking about why Chris Streveler isn't coming out on a 1st and goal at the 7. I think that was the biggest indicator to me. And this is understanding that Ottawa has, a great front. They're a heavy front. They also had some injuries in the secondary. But when it came down to the game on the line against Ottawa, with under a minute remaining, 1st and goal from the 7, this team decided to throw the ball. They decided to throw the ball instead of relying on that offensive line. I don't care if it's Brady Oliveira, Johnny Augustine, Chris Streveler, Nick Dembski. That line used to be reliable to get 7 yards in 3 runs. And instead, I get it, putting the ball in Zach Collaros' hands, a guy who, could be is a multi-MOP winner, but could be even more, and has been the face of this league for a long time now. I understand putting the ball in his hands to win, but I mean, the old team, the old years, you're not saying old, we're talking last season and previous years, that would have been a no-brainer. You rely on the O-line, you get them, they can get you 7 yards in 3 tries. And the fact that the Bombers decided not to, Buck Pierce decided not to do that, tells me everything you need to know about this team right now as they face BC this week. Looking to improve to 1-2 and not 0-3.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we've talked a lot about those decisions on Winnipeg Sports Talk as well. And I mean, listen, I can't say that I would have done anything different than Buck. I mean, when you look at the fact that they just simply weren't winning those line of scrimmage battles, there was a few times where Streveler, who was automatic for a yard, was touch and go to simply advance at 1. When Streveler goes in, they're looking run, they're assuming it's going to be a run. And unless you've got a wrinkle that maybe he's putting it up in the air and you're trying to catch them off guard, I'm not sure that was a winning equation for the Bombers. And hey, you know what? You pay this guy a lot of money. They got it down there to the 7-yard line, put the ball in the hands of your best player and get them to make plays. And they just simply weren't doing it, they didn't get it done, which is why they're at 0-2. While we're on the Bombers, Jeff, let me just quickly throw this out to you. Mm-hmm. There are 3 winless teams in the Canadian Football League right now. The 0-2 Bombers, the 0-2 Elks, who lost to Montreal. They did come for a nice little backdoor cover, but really didn't come close to winning. And the Hamilton Tiger Cats, who, I mean, we'll touch on Tim White's start to the season in a minute, all 0-2 after losses to Calgary and Saskatchewan. If you were ranking the level of concern in these 3 markets, where's the most concern, the most panic right now, albeit just 2 weeks into an 18-game calendar?
It's an interesting question, and I want to say the Blue Bombers just because it's uncharted territory, but I don't think the panic is existing in the locker room, because I think this team is, because of how boring they've been the last few years and their approach week in and week out, they're not going to, they weren't patting themselves on the back with their success, and they weren't, bemoaning the losses when, the few and far in between came. So I imagine they'll take that same approach here. They know they got work to do. They know, this is only adding fuel to their fire, but I think that they're going to be focused and ready to get things done. And we're going to talk about a better East division, in a bit here, but I do think there's a little bit of like the fact that the West isn't doing as well, might benefit the Bombers in the long run, but I imagine that'll figure itself out. When you look at the team with the most panic, I think it's got to be the Edmonton Elks, man, because I mean, if you look at Hamilton, yes, you don't want to start 0-2. No one wants to start 0-2, but those have been close games. They've been battles, right? And they've gotten some incredible play from Bo Levi Mitchell. So there's signs there that are really good. But the Edmonton Elks, there's also been close games, so they certainly have that in their favor. But just given the way things have gone with Chris Jones the last 2 seasons, we talked about this last week, Edmonton needs to do something this year. They need to, they don't just need to squeak into the playoffs. They need to, whatever Chris Jones' vision has been for the last couple of years needs to come to fruition. And an 0-2 start in Edmonton is just compounding things, right? I mean, fans don't care how close the games were. They don't care that they battled with the Montreal Alouettes. All they care about is victories. And until Chris Jones can deliver that, it's going to be tense around the locker room and not a great place to be.
Yeah, the vision in Edmonton needs to include having more points than the opponent at the end of 60 minutes a few
Usually
times.
A recipe
They
for
need
success.
wins. They need to win some football games. They need to give a historically great CFL market a reason to believe in the green and gold. And listen, I know we always hear it. People are still talking about the name change, folks. It has nothing to do with what they're called. It has everything to do with the fact that they have been an embarrassment for a number of years. They went 4 calendar years, I think, without winning a game at Commonwealth Stadium. And you've seen what that's done, the way it has eroded the fan base to the point that they're looking for private ownership. And you would hope that if that happens, it signifies a significant turnaround with the team. And listen, Chris Jones has the opportunity to be the guy and author a big turnaround. And to be honest, I am actually still pretty high on Edmonton as far as the talent that they have on the team. I think McLeod Bethel-Thompson makes them a much better squad. But sometimes...
Have a return man now, finally. Maybe they'll get their first return touchdown since 2015. They had one, but it was called back.
Yeah, there's some envy here considering the return game in Winnipeg on all of that.
Totally.
But they don't have the time that a lot of the other teams have. So, yes, I think it is urgent. It is the most urgent and the most concerning at Edmonton. And I don't feel the same way about the Ticats. And the Ticats playing on the road in Calgary and then at home against a good Saskatchewan team, very much in both of those games. And listen, I mean, the one guy, and I don't like to pick on one player, but Tim White could not have had a more horrific start to his CFL season. I had a great chat with Dustin Nielsen, who I do the lock shop with Monday to Friday over on the Edmonton Sports Talk channel, talking about that first Calgary-Hamilton game. And he said, dude, I mean, Bo looked great. There were some egregious drops from Ticat receivers that really, really cost them in the long run. And then you think about the game on Sunday where all the credit to the Riders, they come back, they tie the game up. There was still plenty of time for Hamilton to go down and kick a winning field goal. And the first play out of the gate, Bo Levi makes a perfect pass to Tim White, who bobbles it and basically does the little volleyball set right into the arms of the Riders, who just like that get the football back. Easy peasy, Brett Lowther, take it. It was the cash and grab, if you will, smash and grab, leaving with 2 points. And the Ticats are saying, wait a second, how the hell did we lose that football game? I think they're on to something. Although the one thing that has to be concerning for Hamilton, and we'll get to this a little bit later on, is just how good the rest of the East has looked so far. And that's not something we've usually spent a lot of time earlier in the season talking about the great start of the Eastern Division at the expense of the West.
I mean, we know how good Tim White is. We know how uncharacteristic that. I don't know if the last time I felt bad for a player in Bo Levi Mitchell after watching that play, because you just, like you said, the ball couldn't be thrown much better, and the ensuing play by Tim White couldn't have set up the interception much better than he did. So I tend to go with Bo's post-game comments. I do think this will be a blip on the radar for them, but these are the kind of plays. These are why teams talk about execution and the importance of execution. Because when, at the end of the day, regardless of, where the East pans out, if they're going to be better this year or what happens, when you're in those final weeks of the season and you're needing to win games and you're jockeying for position in the standings, and you're going to look back at, the early games, and those are the ones that really do help dictate where you finish, obviously. I mean, we all know that all games count for the same amount of points. We often are told that the season really starts after Labor Day. In a lot of ways, that's true as far as, rounding into form and trying to, again, position yourself as best as possible in the playoffs. But it's these early games and executing and ensuring that, you win those tight games and not lose them, that really do make the difference down the line.
We'll talk a little bit more about the East as a division in a second, but let's talk about former Bomber Dru Brown, who got his first start for the Ottawa Redblacks, beat his old team. I'll give a shout out to Paul Lapalisse, and Lapo joined us on was it Tuesday's edition of Winnipeg Sports Talk. If you'd like to check that over on the YouTube channel. And by the way, you can give Lapo a view if you're on YouTube. Bang in Paul Lapalisse and give him a sub over at his piece. He actually did a video of going through every throw that Dru Brown made in his debut for the Ottawa Redblacks. So interesting stuff if you like kind of getting into the mind of coaches. But when he joined us, it really came down to one thing. And despite the Bombers having the opportunity to win that game in the last 10 and in the last couple minutes inside the 10-yard line, you look at the stats, you look at everything that happened in that game, the Bombers turned the football over, Dru Brown didn't. And that had been, you want to talk about Achilles' heel, Jeff? I mean, you look back at the last couple seasons, nobody and no quarterback room had turned the ball over more than Ottawa. That's why they couldn't get up off the mat. A great start for the Redblacks and a really nice start, taking care of the football and doing what it takes to win, kind of like the team that he came from up until this season in Dru Brown's debut.
So first off, Lapo, I think he was on the air in CJOB with Derek Taylor calling that game. And I think for a second there, when Dru Brown delivered that, what ended up being the game-winning touchdown to Jake Hardy, I'm pretty sure he was cheering in his voice. Like he forgot that he wasn't the coach of the Redblacks anymore. But certainly loved listening to Lapo. And
the people on OB listening to the game loved
I think they had, I don't know if DT had to elbow him a little bit and say, "Hey man, this is the Winnipeg broadcast. The team that you used to coach and help win a championship in 2019. Those are the guys that this broadcast is for." Anyways, go check out Lapo's stuff. He does a great job of breaking down complex plays and making them easy to understand, which I find so goddamn ironic, Huss, because he used to not have the time or place to do the same thing for us as reporters. He almost was, I talk about eye rolls, like the Lapo eye roll. Every time he had to come talk to the media when we'd ask him to explain something, it was almost like, "Oh, you dummies, you don't get this yet." It was always done in a playful way, but it's incredible to see, what he does in the booth and into the replays and what he does on YouTube. But anyways, moving over to Dru Brown, you know what? Got a ton of respect for Dru Brown. This is a guy that put in the work. He's got an incredible work ethic. He's absolutely adored by Zach Collaros for that exact reason. His football IQ is through the charts. His perspective is incredible. This is a guy that lost his father unexpectedly last year, and to have the chance to speak to him on the eve of that start against Winnipeg, obviously his former club, a lot of emotions, a lot of pressure on his plate. For him to deliver the performance he did, in the conditions that he did, not just against his former team, as I mentioned, but also in a rain-filled affair, and one that had a late, an hour-long weather delay by the end to figure it out. For him to, I think he was 20 for 33 for 260-something yards and a touchdown, as you mentioned, has zero mistakes. And I think that's, obviously the trademark that Dru Brown has left in his time in the CFL, and a reason why a lot of teams were looking for him this offseason was because of his ability to make smart decisions, and and he did plenty of that. The other thing too about Dru Brown's situation is, he got signed in the offseason to be the number one. There's no doubt about it. The money suggests as much, but he does not have a super long leash. And even walking into Ottawa, I was talking to a few people in and around the organization, like it wasn't a guaranteed Dru Brown offense. And there were some issues in training camp with chemistry with his receivers and leading the offense, which is going to happen when it's a new face to a franchise that has a lot of returning players. But there was no slam dunk. This is our guy, week in, week out, we're going to ride or die with this guy. And Dru Brown has to prove himself every single week. And, even to add to that point, look at the quarterback room. It's got 3 other quarterbacks in Jeremiah Masoli, Dustin Crum, and Tyree Adams, all of whom were number ones on this team last year as they went through an injury-riddled season at the quarterback position. Dustin Crum definitely thought he was going to becoming was the future of this team after getting the number of starts he had. Jeremiah Masoli for sure thinks he's the quarterback of this team after not 1, but 2 years of back-to-back season-ending injuries. So to have kind of that quarterback room in the shadows, and to be clear, Dru Brown has received nothing but, encouraging words and coaching from all 3 of those guys. So it's not an issue with, the camaraderie with the group, but the reality is you have 4 quarterbacks in a room, all of whom believe and feel like they should be the number 1 quarterback. And that doesn't exist anywhere else in the league. So having that as kind of a backdrop to the pressure, it was an incredible performance by Dru Brown. And as we mentioned about organizations needing that love, needing to kind of get back on the right track, as we talked about Saskatchewan, Ottawa's another market. It's a young market. It's an exciting market. It was before these last few years of, underwhelming football, they were one of the most exciting fan bases, certainly the youngest. So, for them to start a season with a victory, I know it's just 1 after a week 1 bye, but just given all the turmoil that organization has had, it's great to see Dru Brown being part of that, hopefully a turnaround in nation's capital.
Yeah, listen, particularly around here, a lot of fans of Bobby Dice, one of the great men in the Canadian Football League, who's got another chance to try to turn this thing around.
Sure.
He hasn't had the quarterback play in the past. He got it in week 1 or week 2. It was week 1 for the Ottawa Red Blacks. And a big part of it, I just have to give a quick stick tap to Tommy Condell. I thought Condell had a game plan that was very creative, and it allowed high percentage plays to quickly get the ball into the hands of the playmakers of the Ottawa Red Blacks. And, you basically get it to Jaden Addison on that and sort of, in motion on a run. There was often 5-7 yards before he was even had the opportunity to be touched by a member of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So, a really nice start for Ottawa, which brings us to the East. But before the East conversation, Jeff, it was a bizarre fourth quarter between Winnipeg and Ottawa in a game that we weren't even sure whether the Bombers were going to get a chance to try to finish their drive and get into the end zone, one that eventually fell short. This one was minutes away from being canceled. And hand up, I was one of those people, along with some friends, that literally were looking up the policy on CFL.ca, trying to remember what happens in a situation with a rain delay late in the fourth quarter in a game that was very much still up in the air.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, man, but Mother Nature just doesn't seem to like me. I don't know if I did something in a previous life or earlier in my own 38 years so far on this planet, but I just seem to get all the rain weather delay games. I've dealt with several in Winnipeg. I've dealt with this one in Ottawa, the one in Edmonton, one in Montreal, one in Calgary. It's wild, and I think with the wildfires, the way they've been raging in recent summers, I think we're going to see potentially some more, weather-related delays. But on this one, it was wild, man. I mean, you're looking at the Bombers. They're at the, they just get a first down to the Ottawa's 42-yard line. It's first and 10, 2:09 remaining, and you can see lightning in the distance to a point where you're like, is this going to get bad? And you start to hear whispers about it moving towards the stadium. And sure enough, it wasn't much longer after they retreated from the field that the rain turned absolutely sideways. And the lightning just got more intense. So, that set forth, as you alluded to, the CFL's weather protocol. And, just to remind fans, because there were a lot of people out there that were, getting to me on Twitter and emailing me and asking me what the situation was, texting me and whatnot. And so I think, a few years ago, I don't know if this, don't quote me on this, but I don't know. It was one of the years with Chris Streveler here. I think it was 2017, 2018, where it was like a 3.5 hour delay with Edmonton. And I think it created a real issue for the players who didn't feel that they should be sitting around for 3.5 hours and playing a game because of the risk to injury. It became a player safety issue. And so, I think that made the league take real stock of their weather protocol and just decide on certain rules that will, put things on paper essentially on how to follow the rules. And so the rule is if a game gets past the midway mark of the third quarter, so at the 7:30 mark and beyond, if a rain delay, if the game goes into a weather delay, then it lasts for 1 hour. If nothing changes and they're not able to safely take the field after an hour's time, the game's called. So the result of what's on the scoreboard is the end result. So in this case, like yourself, I was writing my gamer as if this was going to be one of the most unique endings in CFL history because I didn't see it letting up, and sure enough, it did. So it prevented that from happening. But had it not, that would have been called, and it would have been a Red Blacks win. And there has been one other time only in history that this has happened. It happened in 2019. I believe it was the Saskatchewan Roughriders were given a 17-10 victory over the Montreal Alouettes, and there was still like 2:39 left in the third quarter. That's the only other time I had the over in that game.
I still remember it.
Did you actually?
Yeah.
Wow. Did they not give you your money back, or would they call end result?
I think it probably ended up being graded as a loss. I remember going, wait a second, we've got to get out there. We got another 17 points to score, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
If the game, one thing, this is interesting, and we'll just kind of get this out, and it's all there at the CFL website. But if it is before the halfway point of the third quarter, and the total stoppage time is more than 3 hours, this is the number that you just mentioned, the game will be canceled, and the players will not be required to play on the following day. Based on historical data in which the team leading went on to win 98% of games, it was determined that a team will be awarded the victory in 2 points if it's ahead by 21 or more in the first quarter, 17 or more in the second quarter, 13 or more in the third quarter. What is interesting is if that point differential threshold is not achieved, if the teams play each other again, they participate in a 2-possession shootout prior to their next meeting.
No way.
Yeah, nice. This is something that I didn't know. I
not know this?
2-possession shootout prior to their next meeting, where each team gets 2 possessions starting at the 55-yard line to commence the shootout drive. And this is wild. For each point scored prior to the weather stoppage, teams gain 1 yard toward the opposition's end zone, which determines the club's starting point for each drive. Wow. If Team A leads Team B 15-0 in the weather-delayed game, Team A would start both drives at the 40-yard line, while Team B would begin both drives from the 55-yard line. We have yet to see that, as far as I know.
Wow.
But that is the wrinkle in the rules. If everyone wants to dig into that, and we'll see whether we get that at some point. It was disaster averted. They got back onto the field, and I always think about the folks on the panel. I mean, those guys getting dragged back in. They probably were literally 1 foot out the door, ready to just quickly wrap up the game, and then all of a sudden, you're tap dancing for an hour, waiting for the game to come back. But they got in. Listen, it ended up very well for the Ottawa Red Blacks, and the Bombers have no one to blame but themselves. They had the opportunity. They got back down. They did not get it done. So, Jeff, before we finish up, this has been a league that has been dominated by the West for the majority of the last number of years. Overall, I mean, we've seen a number of crossovers from West to East. There's still been very good East teams. But, man, this East right now, 4-2. Hamilton's 0-2, or 4-2 against the West, I should say. Montreal looks even better this year than they were last year, coming off their Grey Cup win. Toronto had a real impressive win to get things going. Ottawa took care of the football and got a win. And Hamilton could easily be 1-1, if not 2-0, if they could hold on to the football. This is great for the league, and I think speaks to a level of parity and interest that everyone has a shot at the Grey Cup right now early in the season in 2024.
Absolutely. I mean, and, small sample size to be sure, but as you mentioned, that 2 losses were the 2 Hamilton losses to Saskatchewan and Calgary that could have gone the other way, right? So we could be talking about a clean sweep with the East. Regardless of 4-2 or 6-0, it is great news for the CFL for the East Division to just get back up to speed to the West. It's been kind of it's been a running joke for a very long time about how much easier it is to compete in the East. I mean, we've seen the standings; it's staring us right in the face. There are several examples that you can point to that you can finish with you can host a playoff game and have a record that in the East and have a record that was worse than the 4th place team in the West, and that's just been a reality for far too long. We'll see how this goes. We'll see how the rest of the season plays out. But looking at some of the teams in the East, looking at Montreal and the confidence that they've had, looking at potentially what's happening in Ottawa under Dru Brown and Bobby Dice there, looking at what's happening in Toronto, they shock BC. I don't think that is as surprising as many people think. I think a lot of people looked at Chad Kelly's not being with the organization right now, and of course his MOP winning season last year being essentially would bury them. That hasn't been the case with Cameron Duke so far. So credit to Ryan Dinwiddie and what they're doing in Toronto. And of course, we talked about Hamilton. They could have a better result right now if it wasn't for a few plays going here or there. But it just comes down to just being a more competitive year. We're already treated with plenty of great CFL games week in and week out. That's just the nature of this league and the nature of professional sports in a lot of ways. But I do think the parity here is incredible. I do think you're going to see some teams, elevate their game from the East and see some of the teams from the West take a step back or two. We've already seen that with Winnipeg. And BC to a certain degree losing to Toronto. So I think this is just setting up for what's going to be an awesome year, man. I really do see this year as any team's year. There is no standout juggernaut. There's no one talking about the big bad Bombers and how they're unbeatable or how incredible the BC Lions are, a team that many people have picked for the Grey Cup winner this year. And so to see some of the East teams, regain some of that dominance, if you will, or regain some of that respect, at the very least, is a nice sign for what's to come here, I think, in 2024.
Well, just before we go, let's get to this week. By the way, you're watching and listening to a new show on the Winnipeg Sports Talk channel, CFL 110. Great to have you with us, presented by Garage Living Winnipeg. You can give Garage Living a call to revolutionize your work and play space in your garage at 204-999-1234. We should quickly take a look at what's coming up this weekend, Jeff, and pulling up the lines from our friends over at CoolBet Canada. We kick it off with Ottawa versus Montreal, 2 undefeated teams. I'm not sure we would have thought that would be the case when we looked at the schedule looking into week 3. Ottawa, 6.5-point underdogs on the road against the defending Grey Cup champs. BC is here in Winnipeg. Cannot wait for this football game. We remember the BC Lions coming in and thumping Winnipeg at the beginning of last season. Yeah. The Bombers, to their credit, turned it around after that and went 8-0 at home the rest of the way. I am stunned that the Bombers are 2-point favorites in this game. I thought that they might be home dogs for the first time in forever, if not probably a pick 'em. This one opened at 1.5. It's sitting at 2 right now. Toronto at 6-point favorites at home against the Elks, and in the rematch between Hamilton and Saskatchewan, a game that opened at 3.5, now 2.5 for the Saskatchewan Roughriders. But of those lines and the matchups, what intrigues you? What sort of stands out from that? As I said, I'm stunned right now that the Bombers are favorites right now against BC, considering the way they've looked, but also the injuries that they're dealing with that likely will be the case going into Friday night.
I'll preface this by saying gambling on the CFL is incredibly difficult. It just seems like the wildest things happen. So take that into consideration. But I just think it's bananas that the Bombers are favored the way they are. I thought it was bananas that the Bombers were favored by 8 points it got up to against Ottawa last week. And that's not, necessarily saying that the Bombers are going to continue to decrease. I do think they're going to improve week in and week out. I think they do like their game against Ottawa much more than they like their game against Montreal as far as a physicality perspective. But I just think BC is, they got more horses, and you look at the Bombers and they're banged up, they're beat up, and they have some question marks in some pretty important areas. So that's a bit surprising to me. Certainly, like, you look around the league, I'm really looking forward to what the Red Blacks can do against Montreal. Montreal's rolling, so can Dru Brown crack what's a really, really good Alouettes defense? We'll have to wait and see on that one. Obviously, you look at the rematch between Hamilton and Saskatchewan. It's tough to beat a team 2 weeks in a row. So I'm not overly surprised that number went down from 3 or 3.5 to 2.5 for Saskatchewan, because I do think Hamilton's going to be ready to roll. They're going to have a chip on their shoulder after a disappointing loss and want to rectify that, obviously. And then when you look at the other game and being the Elks in Toronto, I mean, we talked about it off the top, man. I mean, the Elks, that's a tall order now with Toronto at home. They play well at home. So, to fall 3-0-3, that is, I'm not saying it's going to be, hot seat for Chris Jones. You imagine he'll get the whole season, but coming out of a 0-3 hole, much like Hamilton and Winnipeg are also staring at potentially here, is not an easy hole to get out of. So there's a lot of pressure on that one. So plenty of intrigue hanging into these games. I still think, we're in the very early stages. So to make definitive statements, certainly opinions are always welcome, but to make definitive statements on teams and where they're going to end up this year, it's just impossible to tell. Teams are still very much getting used to new personnel and new systems and adding plays and all those things. So, I do think, we're going to see some tight matchups here. I don't see any team necessarily dominating another.
By the way, for folks that are in the Winnipeg area, make sure to tune into a Winnipeg Sports Talk for information on how you can win a trip to the Labor Day Classic with myself and Coolbet. And just finishing off, it is interesting. I mean, the beginning of the season, the Bombers were plus 215 favorites. And then it was BC and Montreal at plus 450. No surprise, there's been a bit of a shakeup, and this goes to the wide open landscape of the Canadian Football League. The Alouettes, with their great start, are the favorites right now at plus 325 to win the Grey Cup. But the books still believe in the Bombers. The Bombers are number 2 at plus 350. BC, though, plus 375. The Argos, plus 450. And for you Rider fans that believe now might be the time to get in, still 8-1 on Saskatchewan after their 2-0 start. Ottawa at 9-1. Calgary 18, Hamilton 22, and the Elks rounding things up at 25-1. Jeff, should be a great week in the Canadian Football League. Big one here in Winnipeg on Friday night. But another great 4-day period for CFL fans to get a game a day and an opportunity for us to get back at it next week before we head down to Vegas for the NHL draft to wrap it all up here on CFL 110, brought to you by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Yeah, no boring times here in the near future. So excited to see what all that looks like, and certainly looking forward to another week in CFL and more news to come, man. I know this is going to be a fun season. I know it hasn't been all that great in Winnipeg right now, but there's a beauty to that. There needs to be some adversity in Bomberland, and we'll see how they handle it, but definitely looking forward to this week's games.
Folks, thanks for all the feedback on the first episode. Let us know how what you feel about the takes, what's going on in the league. Hit us up on X at any point. Jeff is at Jeff K. Hamilton. I am at Hustlerama. Love to hear feedback on CFL 110 and everything going on in and around the Canadian Football League. Again, if you're finding us on YouTube, head on over to your favorite podcast provider, search CFL 110 and make sure you're subscribing to the audio podcast. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button on the Winnipeg Sports Talk channel. CFL 110 comes at you midweek Wednesdays every week during the Canadian football season. Hammer, thanks so much for doing this. Have a great one. We'll talk to you next week. For Jeff Hamilton, I'm Andrew Paterson. Appreciate the great support of Garage Living Winnipeg. To make this show possible, give them a buzz, 204-999-1234 for a free in-garage consultation. Enjoy the games this week, everyone. We'll see you next week right here, midfield for CFL 110.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.